Hi everyone, welcome to AP Environmental Science. This lecture is introducing biodiversity. So we're starting our biodiversity unit. So like I said, we're starting our biodiversity unit. This is topic 2.1, Introduction to Biodiversity. The enduring understanding is that ecosystems have structure and diversity that changes over time. The learning objective, explain levels of biodiversity and their importance to ecosystems. So we're going to talk about 4 different levels of biodiversity. The vocab, as usual, you can pause this and jot down the vocab. So I want to start this PowerPoint with this quote. This is an excerpt from the Thanksgiving address, the Mohawk version of the Thanksgiving address. We send thanks to all the animal life in the world. They have many things to teach us as people. We are glad they are still here, and we hope it will always be so. So there is this cultural element to biodiversity that is reflected in this quote, and there is, it's just showing how important biodiversity is on a global level and then on a cultural level for the Mohawk people. But what is biodiversity? Biodiversity can be subdivided into 4 different categories. There is species diversity, so the variety of different species in a given area. Genetic diversity, which is the genetic variability within species, typically within a population or within a species as a whole. Ecosystem or habitat diversity, those are 2 slightly different things I'm going to lump into one, but this is the variety of ecosystems on the planet, the variety of biomes on the planet, and then the habitats within those ecosystems. And then there's functional diversity. This is basically looking at ecosystem services, which we talked about on another day on another PowerPoint, so I'm not going to specifically talk about them in this PowerPoint, but you should know that a very diverse ecosystem creates a lot of different ecosystem services or performs a lot of different ecosystem services, and that diversity of natural and ecosystem services is reflected in biodiversity. Okay, so just diving a little bit deeper into species diversity. Species diversity is an umbrella term that encompasses both species richness and species evenness. So both of those contribute to species diversity. Neither one greater than the other. Okay, so they're basically equal terms. This is the number and variety of different species living in a geographic area. That is basically species richness, the number of species that are present. And then there's species evenness. This is the comparative number of each species that's present, so like the proportion of each species in a given area. So to illustrate that, I have this diagram that shows 2 different communities. In community 1, you can see that each tree represents 25% of the community, and we have 4 species. Okay, so 4 different species. We also have 4 species represented in community 2. But you notice that their proportions are very different. This tree that might be a beech, let's just call it a beech, is dominating. Okay, there's only 6% of maybe oaks, 12% of the pines, and then 12% of the spruces. Okay, so this one beech tree is dominating the community at 70%, and it is changing the species evenness. Okay, community 1 therefore has higher biodiversity because it has a greater species evenness, so greater species evenness than community 2. Community 2 would have a lower biodiversity because it has a lower species evenness. Even if the number of species, or given that the number of species in both of them is equal. Okay. So let's look at a real world example of that. This is just looking at vegetation. Tropical rainforests tend to have both high species richness and high species evenness, whereas a boreal forest tends to have low species richness and low species evenness. So if we look at this tropical rainforest, we have, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those 2 might be the same, so this one has already been accounted for, but 7, I think 8, 9, 10, 11, probably 12 different species that we can see, probably quite a few more that I'm not counting. at least 12 different species in this tropical rainforest. So very high species richness. So there's a wide variety of species. There's many different species present. And then there's a high species evenness as well, because no one plant species, no one tree species is dominating this ecosystem. They're all about even, they're all represented in small numbers, but they're all evenly distributed. Okay. This boreal forest, this might be Sitka spruce, is the only species. So there's one species that we see here, and it has low species richness because there's only one species there, and low species evenness because that one species is about 100% of the tree species in this area. Okay. So reflecting that example, the general trend on the planet is that in the equatorial regions, you tend to have greater species richness, and that species richness will decline as you get closer to the poles. Okay, that's best shown in this graph. So we have 0 degrees latitude, so the equator, very high species richness. Okay, and then as you get into the subtropics, it starts to decrease, and then closer to the poles, either south or north, your species richness is declining. All right. There are some notable exceptions. So you notice that the Sahara Desert, the Arabian Desert, the Gobi Desert tends to have relatively low species richness because they are deserts. But in general, this trend holds out. Okay. And then I list the biomes around the planet that have the greatest species richness. Okay, so again, within species diversity, this is kind of like the umbrella term, and then underneath of that, we have species richness and species evenness. Both of those are contributing to species diversity. Okay. Ecosystems with higher species diversity can better recover from disturbances. A disturbance, I define for you. You guys should already know what a disturbance is, but it's any disruption to an ecosystem. Okay, could be a fire, could be a flood, could be a volcanic event. But in any case, ecosystems with a higher species richness tend to recover better for a variety of reasons. The first is that these highly diverse plant communities produce more biomass, and they produce varied biomass. Okay, so they produce a lot of different types of food. Okay, that's going to supply a large variety of consumers. Highly diverse plant communities create a rich soil seed bank. So if there is a fire, there's going to be a lot of seeds in the soil from all of the plant species, the trees, the shrubs, the herbs, the annuals and perennial plants, the grasses that are all sitting in the soil. They're waiting in the soil for conditions to improve, and it could be that a fire goes through, wipes out the entire canopy, and then as well as the understory, and then the seed bank provides the seeds for the next generation, right? It could be anything. It could be a flood. It could be a landslide. It could be a rock slide. It could be an avalanche. The soil seed bank is critical. The more plant species that you have in an area, the greater your soil seed bank is going to be, or at least the more varied it's going to be. They tend to, highly diverse ecosystems tend to have a lot of different species that occupy slightly overlapping niches, so that if one species goes, it doesn't completely collapse the entire food web. Okay, that is definitely a generalization, and it's not condoning the loss of any species in a highly rich area. But if a species was to go extinct through a natural process, the ecosystem can very easily recover from that because something else will occupy that niche. Okay, Generalists are typically present, and they're not going to be affected by disruptions as easily as specialists. We'll talk about that on a future slide. And then it tends to lead to a high genetic diversity. So high species diversity tends to lead to a high genetic diversity. And obviously all of these are general trends. There is going to be exceptions and contradictions, but big picture, this tends to hold true. All right, so that was species diversity. Let's move on to genetic diversity. This is the genetic variability within a species. We're typically looking at the population level. So you might have heard the term population genetics, which is a field of genetics that focuses on genetic diversity. Okay, recall that alleles are variations of a gene. So when we're talking about allelic diversity, we're also talking about genetic diversity. Okay, the two are basically synonyms. You typically won't see allelic diversity in AP Environmental Science, but if you were to go into population genetics as a field, you would see it a lot. Okay. When there is a lot of genetic diversity present, there may be just randomly some allele that isn't selected for now, but when conditions change, because conditions always will change, when conditions change, it may be advantageous to have that allele in new conditions. Okay, so for example, if we have corn up here on the top right, and we have a lot of, corn is a domesticated species, and it's descended from the teosinte plant, but let's just say that there is a wild population of corn. Okay, maybe it was some agricultural field that was abandoned 50 years ago, and that corn has just kind of reseeded itself on that property. Okay, totally hypothetical situation. Okay, corn is a domesticated species at this point. It's not. It's even a different species than teosinte. All that semantics aside, let's just look at corn. Let's just say that there's a wild population of corn, hypothetically. And in that population, there is a lot of different alleles. You can see all the different alleles that just encode for kernel color or the pigment deposited in the kernels in this picture on the top right. All right, so we have our wild population. Conditions change. Maybe it's a great 50 years, and then all of a sudden there's a drought. There might be just randomly one or two individuals that have alleles that require it to produce less water, or require it to, or cause less water evaporation from the leaves. Maybe the leaves are a little waxier, maybe the leaves have fewer stomata, so they lose water a little bit less than than all the other plants in that population. They are pre-adapted for changing conditions, in this case a drought. That little bit of allelic diversity that happens to be there, that one allele that happens to give them an advantage in a drought condition, will allow those individuals to survive, pass on those alleles to the next generation, while the rest of them may die off. Okay, so it allows that population to survive those changing conditions, in this case a drought. Okay. We're going to talk about corn on the next slides, so I want to break down this diagram. Teosinte is the ancestral species that gave rise to modern day corn. In teosinte, we have what we call, this is again hypothetical and not hypothetical, but a oversimplification. There are neutral genes that we don't really care about in terms of crop production to get large ears of sweet corn. Okay, so there are all these genes that may encode for like alcohol dehydrogenase or catalase or anything that we don't really care about for corn, okay, to produce ears and kernels. There's the domestication gene, those genes that allow us, in this case the red ones, that allow us to domesticate that crop. We have fixed all of corn for those domestication genes, okay? They're 100% of the population. And then there's the improvement gene. These are what give higher yields. So larger ears with fatter kernels with more starch or more sugar, depending on what you want in your corn kernels. We go through this process of domestication, right? Many generations of domesticating teosinte to corn. So that process of domestication. Many of these neutral genes survive because we're not selecting for or against them in this case of artificial selection. We are domesticating for the domestication gene, those genes that allow us to easily plant and raise our crops. And then maybe a few alleles have been lost for the improvement gene, and our yields have gone up a little bit. What we did with modern plant breeding to produce modern inbreds over the past let's say 150, or sorry, not even that long. Let's say 100 years since like the early 1900s, especially kicking off in the mid 1900s. Again, we don't really care about these neutral genes, but some of them are lost just through random genetic drift. All the domestication genes go through, and then in this tiny little bottleneck, we have gotten rid of all of this other variety to where we only look for the ones that give us the large, sweet kernels that we look for. Like if you go into your grocery store at Keen Supers and you see corn, it's going to be white sweet corn, right? Maybe yellow sweet corn, but probably white sweet corn. You're only selecting for these white kernels that produce lots and lots and lots of sugar. You're not selecting for anything else that gives all of this variety in this picture in the top right. So all of that variety has gone away so that you are both improving your yields and you're getting what the consumer wants, which is sweet white corn to make corn on the cob. Okay, it could be that that's what you're looking for. It could be that you're breeding it specifically for feeding to cattle or feeding to chickens. Could be that you're specifically feeding it for or growing it for popcorn. If it was popcorn, maybe you're just selecting for this yellow one and you're not selecting for the green. But in this case, I just chose sweet corn because it's what you guys are familiar with. All right. So you're reducing genetic diversity in our crops because you go through this whole plant bearing process just to select for uniform kernels that are all white, sweet, grow the plants grow at the same rate, they all flower at the same time, etc. So I have that reflected in this diagram on the top right as well, where you have all of this ancestral genetic diversity that gets lost as you go through this bottleneck of population breeding, and you're left with modern corn that is all the exact same size, grows at the exact same rate, is totally uniform, all flowers at the same time, produces kernels or ears that are standardized so that it can go through the machines, and kernels that are the exact same, and whether those kernels are intended for animal feed or popcorn or for cornmeal or for sweet white corn on the cob, doesn't really matter. One field is going to be pretty much the exact same genetically. The problem with that is that a disease that affects one individual that is genetically pretty much identical to every other individual, it can wipe out that entire field, which is what the next slide is showing. Anyway, a drastic reduction in population size, that is basically a bottleneck, which you guys should have talked about in biology when you talked about genetics or when you talked about evolution. These population sizes may decrease through a variety of reasons. It could be a natural process. Typically, this is independent of natural selection, even though I do have disease there. But typically, it's just random reductions in population size, maybe from a volcano or a tsunami or from very rapid climate change, something independent of natural selection, which is what I get to down here. So genetically, it can result from genetic drift, and you should know that genetic drift is a random genetic process that is independent of natural selection. Natural selection may select for those individuals afterwards, but like for example, let's just say that we have a volcano. This is just a very dumb random example, but let's say that we have a volcanic island, and we have all of these different colored flowers on this island. They're all the same species, they can all interbreed, but they're all different colors. Let's just say we have a bunch of red ones. Let's say we have a bunch of green ones. And let's say that we have a bunch of blue ones and yellow ones. Okay, the yellow isn't showing up very well, so let's just say red instead of yellow. Let's just get rid of all the yellow, okay? Say that there's a volcanic eruption that happens, and just randomly it blows up that entire side of the island. So you notice that all the green ones disappear. You notice that all of the yellow ones survive, but instead of yellow, I'm saying red because yellow isn't showing up very well, and all the blue ones survive, or some blue ones survive. So some blue, some yellow, okay? All of the other diversity that's in that population has been eliminated through a totally random event. plants are not able to run away from a volcanic eruption. It's just totally random that all the green ones happen to be towards that side of the island, and there was no green ones over there, and only blue and yellow survive to make our new population. Now, it could be that later on there's an insect pollinator there that specifically targets the yellow flowers and not the blue flowers. That would be natural selection afterwards, but the initial, my bad, the initial reduction in population size that killed many individuals was genetic drift. It was a natural disaster, totally random disaster. Okay. Anyway, so this could result from genetic drift. It could result from artificial selection, humans selecting for corn, or anything else that we have selected for through domestication, or asexual reproduction. There's a few plant species that are basically all clones of one another. Aspen are a great example. And there's very little, if any, genetic diversity there because they're all clones. Okay. So we'll discuss the implications of this in class. To illustrate the implications, I have these two videos about bananas. If you're not in class, you can watch these at home. Okay, let's get to the last one that we're going to talk about, ecosystem and habitat diversity. These are basically lumped into one because they both have the same thing, but they're slightly different. Ecosystem diversity is basically the variety of ecosystems or the variety of biomes on the planet. Each of them have their own unique species assemblage. And then there's habitat diversity, which is the variety of habitats within those ecosystems. So this is larger and this is smaller, because habitat diversity is within ecosystem diversity. Okay, so within a boreal forest, for example, we have the coniferous forest, the aspen forest, the beaver ponds, etc. Okay, both of these are going to lead to higher species diversity because you just have more habitat available for these species to radiate out in, or rather occupy various niches. Within those habitats and those niches, we can have specialists or generalists. Okay, there's obviously a wide range of different species and the niches that they occupy, but in general, we can classify many species into one of these two categories. Okay, some species don't really neatly fall into one or the other. But a specialist is a species with a narrow ecological niche. It typically depends on a single type of habitat, a single food source, and it has a very small range of climatic conditions that it can tolerate. A generalist is a species with a wide ecological niche. It can live just about anywhere. It can eat just about anything. It can tolerate basically a wide range of climatic conditions. Let's say a raccoon can tolerate from the swamps of the south all the way up to the very cold winters of the northern United States. Okay, when you lose habitat, this is going to lose your specialists first, and then your generalists, and we'll talk about why. So some examples of specialists. These first three are animals, and it's just talking about the first two at least are what they eat. So I think that what they eat is the easiest way to think about specialists and generalists. Koalas, they eat one food source, and that's eucalyptus. Panda bears, they eat one food, that's bamboo. Monarch butterfly caterpillars, which is that pretty little caterpillar up there, they only eat milkweeds. Okay, so the reason that specialists are more vulnerable to extinction is that if the milkweed goes, so does the monarch butterfly. Okay, if the entire bamboo forest is cut down, the panda is going to have nothing to eat. The red-cocketed woodpecker up here only lives in old growth longleaf pine forests in the southern United States. Because those forests were mostly logged, there's very few of them left. This bird has mostly, if not totally, disappeared. Okay, and then just a plant example, many cacti, they tend to live in hot, dry environments, so they're specialized to hot, dry environments. Okay, so if their habitat goes away, they have no backup plan, and they can easily go extinct. Many of them are endemics, so they only live in one place around the world. We'll talk about what endemism is on another PowerPoint, but just introduce it here. Now, the reason that they are so successful is that if conditions don't change, they do very, very, very well. They're well adapted for stable conditions. If the old growth longleaf pine forests remain and they just perpetuate into the future, then the woodpecker does very well. If there's a consistent supply of milkweed generation after generation after generation, then the monarch butterfly does really well. However, once conditions change, then they're prone to extinction. We can contrast that with generalists. Again, they eat basically anything. They can survive on basically any type of soil. Some examples: raccoons, American black bears, crows, humans are a great example of generalists. We're a great example of generalists. We can live just about anywhere and survive a very wide variety of climatic conditions. Okay, the American black bear, it can live from the swamps of Florida all the way up to the tundra of Alaska. Very well adapted to a variety of ecological niches and a variety of climatic conditions. They're going to face a lot of competition for the variety of food sources that they try to get. So if we're just looking at a natural setting, the American black bear is going to face competition with all kinds of animals for the berries that it eats, for the roots that it eats, for the carcasses that's going to scavenge. So even though it's competing with just about everything in the ecosystem, it's far less likely to go extinct if conditions change because it has a backup plan. It can shift to another food source. If the berries don't do well one year, then maybe it survives more off of roots and fish. If the fish don't do well one year, maybe the berries did really well. Okay, so they have kind of a backup plan. They can still go extinct, but typically after the specialists do. And I have a diagram here that basically reiterates all that, so you can pause it here and analyze that. So as you may know, there is a sharp decline in biodiversity around the globe, and the primary cause for that is human activity. There are we can categorize these activities into 6 different fields, and there's an acronym for those 6 different things. So habitat loss, which is illustrated by the clear cutting and burning of forests in this picture. Invasive species, so I chose the Burmese python to represent invasive species. This is an invasive species in the Florida Everglades, which we'll talk about in class. This first P, actually, it doesn't matter which of these 2 P's stands for which, but human population growth, so just a huge increase in the number of people on the planet, pollution, and then climate change represented by the little polar bear on its tiny little float of ice, its tiny little iceberg, and overexploitation being represented by the shark fins drying on in this warehouse or rooftop or whatever it is. Okay, so this acronym, HIPCO, you guys should know for this class, it discusses or it represents the different ways that we're leading to the loss of biodiversity around the planet. And again, habitat loss, invasive species, human population growth, pollution, climate change, and overexploitation. To connect this back to ecosystem or habitat diversity, how are we changing habitats? Well, that is habitat loss and our acronym of HIPCO. So habitat loss, I guess I had it right there. This threatens species and genetic diversity. Okay, so we're looking at species diversity and we're looking at genetic diversity. The number of species there and the species evenness of a place, and then the genetic diversity. If you have small, tiny little patches of habitat, and say that there is an arboreal species like a monkey that physically cannot pass from this little patch of habitat over to this more connected patch of habitat, this is going to become an isolated species in there, or an isolated population rather. It's going to become an isolated population, interbreed with itself, and reduce genetic diversity. If this entire area was forested, then you can have a much larger population, and that large population can interbreed with many different family groups and increase genetic diversity, but that's not what we're seeing in this image. Okay, so isolated populations can't interbreed and share alleles with one another, and you get small inbred populations, okay, which results in inbreeding depression. Habitat fragmentation, so that threatens species with large geographic ranges. So think of your large mammals, they tend to have large geographic ranges. Large predators especially tend to have large geographic ranges. Okay. One solution for habitat loss and habitat fragmentation are wildlife corridors or habitat corridors. Okay, this allows small isolated populations to interbreed with one another and increase their genetic diversity. So on this bottom right image, let's just say this is Southern California. Let's just say we have a cougar or mountain lion or puma population over here. So population 1 on the right side of a highway and population 2 on the left side of a highway. Okay, if there was this highway there, they would be isolated populations, except for the rare individual that could pass the highway without getting hit by a car and interbreed and share alleles. Okay, that's a very risky process. But instead, what this community did was set up high fences along this highway that funnels any animal traveling from one side of the highway to the other along this habitat corridor. Okay, so they have this bridge that is specifically designed for wildlife, tries to mimic the natural areas of the land. You even see that the exit ramp off of this highway, or maybe it's a different road, is going through an underpass as well, extending this corridor. So animals are able to move from population 1 to population 2 unimpeded, and they can spread alleles from one population to another. So they reduce that inbreeding depression. Okay, over on this left-hand side is one of the largest habitat corridor projects in the world. It's called the Yellowstone to Yukon project, and it tries to connect Yellowstone National Park down in Wyoming, a little bit of Montana, and a little bit of, I believe, a little bit of Idaho, but I think just Wyoming and Montana. Tries to connect Yellowstone all the way up to the Arctic, so that species with very large ranges, like a wolf that can roam for thousands of kilometers or thousands of miles in a season, can interbreed, and you can have all of these populations interbreeding with one another and exchanging alleles all the way up to the Yukon. Okay, this is a huge project that links several national parks, several national forests, and private lands as well, including ranching lands, to establish this very large set of corridors. Obviously, this doesn't mean that this is pristine, intact habitat from Yellowstone all the way up to the Yukon, but it's a series of corridors from the Yellowstone to the Yukon that connect large, relatively undisturbed patches of habitat. Okay, so just looking at one potential solution for habitat loss. All right, so going back to the essential knowledge, biodiversity and ecosystem includes genetic, species, and habitat diversity. We can also add functional diversity to that as well, which again is basically ecosystem services, which we discussed in a different PowerPoint. This second learning objective is talking about genetic diversity, and then large number of species likely to recover from disruptions. Loss of habitat means that you lose specialists first, followed by generalists, and then species richness. All right. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I'll see you on class.